Every single day, perfectly sane, functioning, tax-paying adults wake up, look outside, and make the conscious decision to throw a leg over a machine that offers zero protection, sits on two wheels, and will absolutely humble you the moment you stop respecting it. And not only do they do it, they love it. They crave it. They spend money they don't have on gear they probably don't need just to do it more. So what is actually wrong with these people? Today we're going to find out. My name is Carl. I ride motorcycles. I have for a long time. And if you've been around this channel for more than about 45 seconds, you already know that I have something of a complicated relationship with the hobby. I've crashed. I've spent money that would make a financial advisor physically ill. I've stood in a parking lot at 10 o'clock at night trying to explain to my significant other why I absolutely needed a third bike. I did not win that argument, by the way. But here's the thing, despite all of that, despite every single rational reason to walk away and just buy a sensible crossover SUV like a normal person, I keep coming back. And so do millions of other people around the world. Which got me thinking, why? Like genuinely, psychologically, what is happening inside the brain of someone who looks at a motorcycle and thinks, yes, that is a great idea, I want more of that in my life. So I went deep on this one. I read studies, I watched lectures, I annoyed people at dinner parties, asking them about risk perception. And what I found is honestly fascinating, because it turns out riders aren't just adrenaline junkies with a death wish. The psychology behind why people ride is way more layered and way more interesting than that. So let's get into it. And hey, if you want to talk about this stuff with people who actually get it, we've got a Discord server with thousands of members, riders, soon-to-be riders, and people who are just curious about the whole two-wheeled thing. Link is in the description. Jump in. The sensation-seeking personality. Alright, let's start with the most obvious place, which is the fact that some people are just wired differently than others when it comes to seeking out new and intense experiences. And I don't mean that in a hand-wavy, unscientific, vibes-based kind of way. I mean there's actual research on this. Back in the 1960s and 70s, a psychologist named Marvin Zuckerman developed something called the sensation-seeking scale. The basic idea is that human beings exist on a spectrum when it comes to how much novelty, intensity, and risk they need in their lives to feel stimulated. Some people are totally content with a quiet evening, a cup of tea, and a good book. Genuinely good for them. And then there are the people who feel physically restless and almost irritable when life gets too routine. Those people score high on Zuckerman's scale. High sensation seekers, which is what the research calls them, share a bunch of common traits. They tend to be more open to new experiences. They get bored faster than the average person. They're more likely to travel to unusual places, try unusual foods, pursue unusual hobbies. And crucially, they tend to underestimate the risks associated with the activities they enjoy, because those activities are providing them with something their nervous system genuinely needs. Now you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but that just sounds like someone describing every motorcycle rider I've ever met. And yeah, that tracks. Studies that have looked specifically at motorcyclists have consistently found that riders score significantly higher on sensation-seeking measures than non-riders. And before you use that as ammunition to tell your family that you're not reckless, you're just neurologically unique. Hold on. Because it's more nuanced than that. High sensation seeking doesn't mean someone is impulsive or stupid. In fact, the research separates sensation seeking into different components. There's thrill and adventure seeking, which is the desire for physically risky activities. There's experience seeking, which is more about novelty and new sensations. There's disinhibition, which is about social boundaries. And there's boredom susceptibility. Motorcycle riders tend to score highest on thrill and adventure seeking and experience seeking specifically, not necessarily on the more reckless disinhibition end of things. Which means that the psychological profile of the average motorcycle rider isn't someone who just doesn't care about consequences. It's someone whose brain is genuinely hungry for intensity, and who has chosen motorcycling as the vehicle, no pun intended, for feeding that hunger. The other thing Zuckerman found, and this is the part that's going to make your parents even more annoyed, is that sensation seeking has a strong genetic component. So if you ride motorcycles and your mom thinks you're out of your mind, The correct response is technically, Mom, this is partially your fault. Risk perception versus reality. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you ask most people why motorcyclists ride despite the danger, the assumption is usually that riders either don't know how dangerous it is or they just don't care. And both of those assumptions are almost entirely wrong. Studies on risk perception in motorcyclists consistently show that riders are actually very aware that motorcycles are statistically more dangerous than cars. They're not operating under some delusion that nothing bad can happen to them. Most experienced riders can rattle off crash statistics without blinking. We know the NHTSA numbers. We know the per-mile fatality rates. We've heard it from concerned relatives at every holiday gathering since we started riding. So if riders know the risk, why do they still ride? This is where risk perception psychology gets fascinating. Human beings are genuinely terrible at processing statistical risk in a rational, linear way. Our brains didn't evolve to weigh probability distributions. They evolved to react to immediate, visible, concrete threats. A lion in front of you is terrifying. A 1 in 10,000 chance of something bad happening next Tuesday is basically invisible to your emotional brain, even if your logical brain understands the number perfectly well. Motorcycle riders have something that psychologists call optimism bias, which is the tendency to believe that bad outcomes are less likely to happen to you specifically than to other people. Every rider who has ever said, "I know people crash, but I'm a careful rider," has just demonstrated optimism bias in real time. I have said this many times. Sitting here with full awareness of what it is, and I still believe it a little bit, which is the infuriating thing about cognitive biases. But here's what's actually kind of important about this. The Hurt Report, which is probably the most cited motorcycle safety study in history, found that the vast majority of motorcycle accidents that involved another vehicle happened because the other driver failed to see the motorcyclist, not because the rider was doing anything insane. And single vehicle accidents were largely attributed to rider error in challenging situations. What that tells us is that experienced riders who practice proper defensive riding, who develop what some people call invisibility training, who stay sharp and stay aware, genuinely are reducing their real-world risk in a meaningful way. The risk is real. Nobody sane is going to tell you motorcycles are as safe as cars, but the gap between perceived risk from the outside and actual risk for a skilled, attentive, geared-up rider is meaningfully smaller than most people think. Riders aren't blind to risk. They've just made a calculated decision that the risk, properly managed, is worth what they get in return. Which brings us to what they actually get in return. The control paradox. This one is my personal favorite, because it sounds like a contradiction right up until it doesn't. From the outside, riding a motorcycle looks like a relinquishing of control. You're exposed. You're vulnerable. One bad moment, and there's nothing between you and the pavement. So how on earth do riders consistently describe motorcycling as one of the most controlled, focused, deliberate experiences of their lives? Welcome to what I'm calling the control paradox. And it's real, and it's one of the most psychologically compelling reasons people ride. When you're on a motorcycle, every single input matters. The amount of throttle you give coming out of a corner, where you position your body, where your eyes are looking, how smoothly you apply the brakes, how much lean angle you carry through a bend. Every one of those things has an immediate, direct, tactile consequence that you can feel through the handlebars, through the seat, through the pegs underneath your feet. There is no distraction on a motorcycle. You cannot be mentally half somewhere else. You cannot be replaying an argument from work or composing a passive-aggressive email to your landlord in your head. The bike will not allow it. The moment your attention drifts, you feel it, and you immediately come back. The machine demands everything you've got every single second. And paradoxically, that demand, that total unforgiving requirement for your full presence and attention, feels like control, not the absence of it. Think about what a typical modern car is doing to the riding experience. It's insulating you, noise cancellation, automatic everything, stability control intervening before you even knew the car moved. You can eat a sandwich, make a phone call, argue with your passenger, and the car is still going to get you there. The car is increasingly doing the driving for you. And for a lot of people, that's great. That's exactly what they want from a commute. But for a certain type of person, that insulation feels like disconnection. It feels passive. And motorcycling is the antidote to that. It's the experience of being fully, completely, actively in charge of every moment of the journey in a way that nothing else on public roads really replicates. Psychologists who study locus of control, which is basically the degree to which people believe they are in control of outcomes in their own lives, have found that people with a high internal locus of control, meaning people who believe their actions directly determine their outcomes, are more drawn to activities like motorcycling. Because motorcycling is fundamentally an activity where your skill, your attention, and your decision-making are the primary variables. You are not a passenger. You are the entire equation. Flow state and the meditative rider. There's a Hungarian psychologist named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And yes, I practiced that pronunciation 4 times before recording this, and I'm still not confident. He developed a concept in the 1970s and 80s that he called flow. You've probably heard of it. It's that state of total absorption where you're so completely dialed into what you're doing that time distorts, self-consciousness disappears, and everything outside the task simply ceases to exist for a while. Athletes call it being in the zone. Musicians feel it. Surgeons feel it. Writers chase it. Motorcyclists live in it. The conditions Csikszentmihalyi identified as necessary for flow are almost suspiciously similar to what a good ride on a twisty road actually is. You need a task that is challenging enough to require your full attention, but not so overwhelming that it causes panic. You need immediate feedback from your actions. You need clear goals. And you need a feeling of personal control over the outcome. A motorcycle on a good road checks every single one of those boxes simultaneously. What's interesting from a neuroscience perspective is what's actually happening in your brain during flow. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-monitoring, social anxiety, rumination, second-guessing, the part that pipes up at 2 in the morning to remind you of something embarrassing you did in 2006, that part goes quiet. Psychologists call it transient hypofrontality, which sounds like a disease but is actually the opposite. It's your brain operating at peak efficiency by essentially turning off the noise. For people who struggle with anxiety, with overthinking, with a brain that just will not stop running in the background, a motorcycle isn't just a vehicle, it's 2 hours of genuine, neurologically enforced mental quiet. And you cannot get that from a meditation app. Trust me, I've tried. My brain laughed at the meditation app. The motorcycle, though, the motorcycle works. This is why so many riders describe coming back from a long ride and feeling reset. Not just physically tired, but mentally clean in a way that's genuinely hard to replicate through other means. The ride process is something. It's not entirely understood, but the anecdotal evidence from millions of riders across decades of motorcycling culture is so consistent that it's hard to dismiss. Riders don't always have the psychological vocabulary to describe what's happening. They just say things like, "It clears my head," or "I can't think about anything else when I'm riding." But what they're describing, whether they know it or not, is flow. And flow, it turns out, is one of the most reliable sources of well-being and life satisfaction that psychology has ever identified. So yeah, motorcycling is basically therapy. Expensive, occasionally terrifying therapy, but therapy nonetheless. Identity, tribe, and belonging. Alright, I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough credit in conversations about why people ride, and that's the social dimension. Because motorcycling is not just something you do. For most riders, it becomes something you are. And that distinction matters a lot psychologically. Human beings are tribal by nature. We evolved in small groups, and we are neurologically wired to seek belonging, to find our people, to identify with a community that reflects our values and our identity back to us. This is not a weakness. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of human psychology. In motorcycle culture, whether you're talking about the ADV crowd, the sport bike scene, the cruiser world, the dual sport community, or any of the dozens of other tribes that exist within the broader riding world, is extraordinarily good at providing that sense of belonging. Think about the biker wave. 2 strangers on motorcycles passing each other on a highway, and there's an acknowledgement. A small, low gesture that says, "I see you, we share something, you're one of mine." I've driven cars for years, and I have never once waved at a random stranger in a Camry and had them wave back with genuine warmth. It doesn't happen. But on a bike, it happens constantly, and it never really loses its meaning no matter how long you ride. There's a concept in social psychology called in-group identity, which is basically the psychological bond that forms between people who share a meaningful group membership. And the interesting thing about in-group identity is that the stronger the external perception that the group is unusual or misunderstood, the tighter the bond within the group tends to become. Which might explain why motorcycle culture feels so cohesive even across wildly different styles of riding. The guy on the fully loaded Africa Twin with 40 liters of luggage, and the guy on the stripped naked Street Fighter, and the guy on the vintage cafe racer with questionable brakes don't have a whole lot in common on the surface. But they will absolutely acknowledge each other on the road and talk for 45 minutes at a gas station if given the chance. Because the shared identity goes deeper than the specific bike. Psychologists who study identity also note that activities which carry social stigma or outside disapproval tend to strengthen group bonds even further. Because when the outside world looks at your tribe and says you're all slightly unhinged, the natural response is to lean into the community even harder. Which brings me neatly to the next section. The defiance factor. Let's be honest about something. Part of the appeal of motorcycling is that it is slightly transgressive. Not in a criminal way, not in a genuinely harmful way. But there's something about throwing a leg over a motorcycle that mainstream society just cannot fully get behind, and deep down, a lot of riders know that, and a small but meaningful part of them enjoys it. Psychologists have studied something called reactance. It's the motivational state that kicks in when people feel their autonomy is being threatened or their choices are being judged. When someone tells you that you really shouldn't be doing something, there's a well-documented psychological mechanism that fires up and makes you want to do that exact thing even more than you did 5 minutes ago. It's why every time a concerned relative sits you down to explain that motorcycles are dangerous, you walk away thinking about which bike to buy next. It's not immaturity. It's just how human brains work when they feel boxed in. Now, I'm not saying every single person who gets into motorcycling is doing it as a direct, conscious act of rebellion. Some of them absolutely are, and they know exactly who they are and honestly respect. But for most riders, it's subtler than that. We live in a world that has been relentlessly optimized for safety, convenience, and comfort. Everything has been padded, risk assessed, monitored, and smoothed out. Your car warns you if you drift 2 inches toward the lane line. Your phone tells you to stand up if you've been sitting too long. There's an app for literally everything that used to require you to just figure it out yourself. And look, a lot of that is genuinely good. I'm not out here arguing against seatbelts. But for a certain type of person living entirely inside that padded, optimized, frictionless bubble starts to feel like something important is missing. Like life is happening to you rather than being actively lived by you. And choosing a motorcycle, something inherently imperfect, demanding, exposed, and unforgiving, is a way of opting back in. It's a deliberate choice to accept some difficulty and discomfort in exchange for something that feels real in a way that the sanitized version doesn't. Erik Erikson, one of the foundational figures in developmental psychology, spent a lot of his career writing about the human need to build a genuine, coherent sense of identity. Not the identity you drifted into by default, the one you actually chose, the one that reflects something true about who you are. And for a huge number of riders, motorcycling serves exactly that function. It is a choice that feels chosen. Consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of the consequences, chosen. There is something genuinely psychologically healthy about that. The act of saying, I see the comfortable option, I understand the comfortable option, and I am deliberately choosing something harder and more alive instead. Even if your mom thinks you've lost your mind. Which she does. She called me, actually. She's worried. Section 7. Are riders actually crazy? So we've covered sensation seeking. We've covered risk perception. We've covered control and flow and identity and defiance. Which brings us to the big question, the one that gets asked at every family dinner and in every concerned comment section. Are motorcycle riders actually crazy? And the answer, which I think is genuinely more interesting than either yes or no, is that motorcycle riders represent a very specific psychological profile. Not a broken one, not a reckless one, but a distinct one. High sensation seeking, strong internal locus of control, a need for focused, absorbed experience, a tendency toward optimism about personal risk, a strong identification with a community of like-minded people, and a genuine, somewhat defiant commitment to choosing intensity over comfort. That profile, when you lay it out like that, doesn't sound like someone who is crazy. It sounds like someone who is just wired in a way that requires a particular kind of outlet. And the outlet they've chosen happens to be one that the outside world finds alarming. Here's what the research actually says about the mental health of regular motorcyclists. Studies have found that riders report higher levels of emotional well-being, greater sense of freedom, reduced stress, and stronger feelings of personal identity than comparable non-riders. The act of riding, when practiced consistently and with proper skills and gear, is associated with genuine psychological benefits that are measurable and significant. That does not mean motorcycling is without real danger. It absolutely is dangerous, and anybody who tells you otherwise is either lying or selling you something. The statistics are real. The risks are real. Gear matters, training matters, attention matters, and there is no amount of psychological benefit that changes the laws of physics. But the reason people keep riding, keep coming back, keep spending embarrassing amounts of money on another set of tires or another set of leathers, or yes, another bike, is not because they're irrational. It's because the experience is providing something that is genuinely hard to find anywhere else. The focus, the freedom, the community, the identity, the flow, the quiet in a brain that never otherwise shuts up. Marvin Zuckerman spent decades studying sensation seeking, and one of his conclusions was that high sensation seekers who find appropriate channels for their need for intensity, meaning channels that are skilled activities with real community and real competence required, tend to live very fulfilling lives. The sensation seeking itself isn't the problem. What matters is where it goes. For a lot of us, it went here to two wheels and open roads, and that specific sound and exhaust makes it 7,000 RPM when you've got a good stretch of empty tarmac ahead of you and nothing else on your mind at all. And honestly, I can think of worse places for it to go. So that's the psychology behind why people ride motorcycles, despite the risks. And if you take anything away from this, let it be that the next time someone asks you why you ride and looks at you like you've just told them you collect live grenades as a hobby, you can tell them that you are a high sensation-seeking, flow-state-chasing, internally focused, autonomy-asserting individual with a strong tribal identity and an optimism bias, and that your therapist, if you had one, would probably find the whole thing very interesting. Or you can just say, because it's fun, you Philistine. If you enjoyed this one, smash that like button, drop a comment below, and let me know, are you a writer? What keeps you coming back? I genuinely want to know. And if you're not a writer yet, but something in this video resonated with you, maybe that's a sign. Go take the MSF course. Seriously, best decision I ever made. Well, top 5. The bikes are definitely top 5. I'll catch you in the next one. In fact, Marvin Zuckerman himself was reportedly a fairly cautious driver. Make of that what you will. Goodbye.